Hi, everyone. Welcome to another AMA. We're really excited today because not only do we have Joe Testani on the line, we're also joined with a very special guest, Cruzvergara, who is the VP of Higher Education and Student Success at Handshake. Hi, guys. How's it going?
Hi, things are going well.
Thanks for being with us today, Christine.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Yeah, we're so excited to jump into some really good conversation. For anyone new to the AMA, if this is your first one, thanks for joining. But I did want to just lay out some ground rules, I guess. We do ask that you stay on mute and that you might see that your video is not turned on, which is okay. And if you have any questions, we ask that you use the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of the screen if you hover. Click on Q&A, and then you'll be able to just jump in and send any questions our way. We do have two people on the back end helping me moderate some questions. So if you don't see Joe or Christine answer them live on video, you may get a direct response, which is essentially a chat feature. So I just wanted to put that out there, and please send us your questions. All right, Joe, you ready to jump into the conversation?
Let's do this.
Okay, so I have here, Joe, that you had a question that you were hoping to ask Christine in regards to sharing some of what she's seen from the perspective of Handshake about employer behavior and then also student behavior. Do you want to expand upon your question a bit more?
Yeah, Christine, before we get into some of these questions, it would be great maybe if you can give your 60-second spot on Handshake and what you do there for them, and then we can kind of jump into some of the things that Handshake's doing to really help students out during COVID-19.
Sure. In 60 seconds, Handshake is essentially the #1 place for college students to find internships and jobs, in large part because we partner with 900 plus universities to connect about 400,000 employers and 17 million students and alumni.
It's pretty good. So I think it was 20 seconds.
20 seconds.
Impressive. And I'm proud to say that when I first arrived at the U of R, we went to Handshake as one of the first things that we did. So we've been a Handshake member and partner with them for 5 years now. And so it's been a great partnership. And I think the main reason we went with them was because we thought it would really be an opportunity to give a lot of access to our students to great opportunities with amazing organizations all over the world. So Christine, obviously you sit at this nexus of students, higher ed and universities, as well as employers that are seeking talent. I'd love to hear what you've been seeing kind of at that intersection, especially since over the last 2 months, and what you're seeing in terms of trending, in terms of opportunities available and employer sort of activity, as well as some of the things that you've heard from students about their needs right now.
Yeah, I'll start with students first. I think in the first month, as we started to see COVID hit, we saw lots of institutions close down, things like that. Not surprisingly, we saw student activity sort of immediately drop. I think they were more focused on sort of that lower level of Maslow's hierarchy. They're trying to get home. They're trying to figure out how to do online classes. Everything just sort of psychologically and emotionally, I think, was very difficult for them. And so understandably, career was not going to be at the top of their list at that time. They needed to sort of just get settled and feel safe. As that started to sort of taper off, and I think schools, students, faculty, everybody's starting to get a little bit more settled into the whole work from home routine, we started to see student activity spike in the past couple of weeks. So we're seeing students activate, we're seeing them re-engage, we're seeing them log in, we're seeing them search at much higher levels just within the past week or two than we saw for the whole first month. That's helpful since on the employer end, for the first month, over 50% of our employers said that they were just focused on trying to evaluate the situation from a business perspective, what was happening to their own companies, what was happening to their clients, were they going to be able to continue their internships or hiring, what was that going to look like? And then obviously, just last week, we posted a 500, sort of a top 500 list of employers that are still hiring on Handshake. And that's not comprehensive by any means. It's just 500 is a slightly more manageable number for both students and parents and universities to be able to like help their students. So the good news is there is still activity and there is still hiring, even though it's less than what we've seen in past years.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. And I guess what would you say is important for students to be doing right now, and how can they use Handshake as a vehicle? It's not the end all be all, obviously, solution for them to do all their sort of to address all their concerns, but I think it's also a really powerful tool. So how would you recommend students to use that as a vehicle to navigating what's going on right now?
Yeah, so I love this question, even though I didn't ask you to ask this question. I think one of the things that is so important is that students have to focus on what they can actually control, right? There's so much out there that is out of their control. They can't fix the economy, they can't fix the pandemic, but what they can do is take care of the things that are literally at their fingertips. So when it comes to Handshake, for example, a student can actually log on. They can actually use the system. They should first figure out how to fill out and complete their profile. That's first and foremost. So we know through our research that a student who completes their profile, at least 3 sections of it, their geographic preference, their job role interests, and their job preferences, are 80% more likely to get messaged by an employer. Awesome. Right? So that's huge. There's no reason why a student shouldn't do those things. And they should also continue networking. I think that's the piece that most career centers are continuing to tell students to engage in. So they can use Handshake, for example, to read reviews from other students or peers. They can use peer messaging to actually reach out to students and alums, not only at their current institution, so not just Rochester folks, but they can also reach out to students at other Handshake network universities. So it really amplifies their ability to still be quite proactive during this time.
That's great. And then I think just to add from our standpoint, from our office, I think what we've been doing is pushing our alumni and the employers that we work really closely to update their profiles, update their postings and opportunities. We've been reaching out to alumni to provide new opportunities, whether it's internships or full-time job offers or opportunities to students. So I think we've been actively managing our network and the U of R community to make sure that they're utilizing the platform as a vehicle to get information to students as well about what is actually active. Because like you said, I think there is a number of areas that are still hiring and organizations that are still looking for talent to that end. And then I want to get to Danae and some of the questions she might have from the audience, as well as that she might be curious about. Do you think, are there certain industries that you're seeing as really kind of still prolifically looking for talent or looking for hires, or are there certain ones that are really kind of standing out to you that you've seen from some of the data that you've looked at?
Yeah, so there's 5 that I would sort of call everyone's attention to. So on our platform, we are still seeing pretty active hiring across education, technology, healthcare, government, and surprisingly, nonprofit. Those are the 5 areas that we're still seeing quite a bit of activity. And I think it's probably also no surprise that when you're looking at the different job roles, you're still seeing a lot of sort of data scientist, data engineer, those sort of oriented roles are quite popular across all of those sectors. You're also seeing sales across many of those sectors be something that people are still looking for and hiring for. AEs, or sort of like account executives, are also still quite popular, again, across all of those sectors. So if students are interested in thinking about how they can be more flexible in using their skill set, those are some of the areas I would encourage you to have them look at.
Awesome, thank you. And the last thing before we kick it over to Danae, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, before obviously you started working at Handshake, you worked in the higher education and career education sector for 10 years. And so I think you bring obviously a lens to this that's also a little different because you worked in my position and at similar institutions around the country. So I think Christine will be answering some of the questions that might pipe up from students that I think she can offer a really interesting lens as well to that. So Danae, I don't know if you had any specific questions or if there's some things that you wanted to field from the audience.
Yeah. Before we jump into some of these questions, I just want to say, Christine, that 500 company list is so awesome. We shared it out with some of our networks here, and I'm so grateful that companies like Handshakes and other companies out there are producing these resources, because I think they're so helpful, and it's such a relief to be able to go to something like that and search in a company that you're curious about, because I don't know if we didn't have something like that, what it would even look like. So I just want to put it out there. Thank you to you and your team and all the great work that you are currently doing to help this situation.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And we want to take it a level deeper, actually. So for Rochester, I think Joe already knows this for Rochester, but one of the things that we really want to make sure is visible to all of our Handshake partners is actually a dashboard that's specific to your institution. So within the week or so, our engineering team's still working on it. We'll be able to release an in-product dashboard that is also going to tell you specifically who's hiring at University of Rochester. And that'll be true across our 900 institutions. So you're also not just looking at the public 500 list, but you can also look at one that's quite specific for your student population. So thank you, Danae. I'm so glad that was really helpful.
Wow, that's such a cool update. Thank you for sharing that. I'm excited to see that roll out. Okay, so we do have some questions. Let's jump in.
Okay.
Okay, so either one of you can jump in with this. So we have a question saying, I'd love to hear a bit more about what graduate students should do at this time and how they should interact with the job market, especially PhDs who might be in the humanities.
Sure. Christine, did you want to tackle that or you want me to take it first?
You can take it first. I'll jump on.
Awesome. I think my first piece of advice, I think, around this one is that you should continue to do the same things you were doing prior to COVID, right? There are certain critical things that are necessary in a job search. How engaged are you with your network and your community? How involved are you in updating and being active? I think Christine mentioned at the top about Handshake. If you're not applying for something, you're already out of the loop for opportunities because you're not engaging in the process of getting into the market. So I think those are really critical things to continue. Being super active in applications, but also tapping into your community and your network, I think are going to be really critical elements. I think what's really important right now is how well are you able to pivot? How well are you able to adapt to new areas that might be hiring? So Christine mentioned those top 5 areas. If those weren't areas that you were considering prior, I think they're really important areas to be considering now because as we know, the higher ed market is really freezing up. And I think a lot of institutions are halting their hiring of faculty members and a lot of positions across the board, and U of R is not really sort of an area that we're doing the same thing at U of R. So I think it's important to really think about where can you apply some of your skills? How do you transition or transfer your application, whether it's your CV, transferring it to a more of a resume-based format to be applicable to industry. I think those are going to be really critical things to be thinking about and evaluating what you can bring. And the last thing I'll say is what need or what problem can you help companies solve right now? How can you really sell to them that you actually have a value add that you can bring to the table to an organization? I think many organizations are trying to figure out how to respond to COVID in the immediate future, but also the long-term future. What does this mean for the changing of their businesses or the services that they provide? And where do you fit into that equation? Can you contribute something to help them solve those short-term or long-term challenges? And how does your degree really apply to that problem? And you have to be very proactive in putting that out there because I've always said this in a good market and a bad market, recruiters and people evaluating talent tend to be a little lazy. And I think you have to really kind of show them what you can contribute because they're going to be getting inundated with applications. The ones that stand out are the ones that really kind of are articulate about how you can help solve the problem. So I'll stop there. I don't proceed if you wanted to add anything or provide additional color to that.
No, that was really thorough. I think we'll just leave it at that. But I'm curious, based on actually what you just said there, are you at Rochester seeing a difference between the populations that are choosing to still utilize career services right now, meet with your team? Like, are you seeing more grad students versus undergrad, certain class years more than others? And do the concerns seem to be pretty similar across the board or quite different?
I think it's a great question. I think obviously our seniors there's a lot of anxiety with our seniors right now. I think we've been outreaching to some of them more directly to engage them and figure out like where they're at. I think many students have not necessarily had offers rescinded for full-time offers, but there's just anxiety. Students were just about starting to ramp up their job searches. So I think there's uncertainty as to where should they be looking? Are there going to be jobs available? How systemic is this going to be? How long is this going to last? So I think we've been trying to highlight where are the marketplaces that are still actively hiring. I think our graduate students really kind of fall into a wide spectrum. If they're in the humanities or the hard sciences or engineering, I think they've been approaching this a little bit differently. For those going to academia, I think those are going to be the hardest hit students, unfortunately, within the PhD ranks, because some of their options have are drying up because of higher ed hiring and some of the freezes that are happening. But I also think it's a great opportunity to look at the education space, and you mentioned education is still hiring, but in a very different way. And so I think there's been a proliferation of online learning and K through 12 support, or even online tools for higher education. And I think they're looking for people that have understandings of teaching, have research backgrounds in areas that might be relevant to some of the topics that are really critical right now in this COVID environment. So I think there's a great opportunities to really transfer and pivot into other areas that really might be valuable. But how do you do that? And how you tell your story are going to be at the cornerstone of that. I think our office is looking to help students do a better job of really kind of conveying that story or conveying that change to different industry sectors or as a network with alumni or different organizations.
That's great.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So we have another question coming in. What options and strategies are there to seek internships online, particularly in the technology and healthcare sectors?
Christine, you want to start with that one about where things are in Handshake?
Yeah, certainly. So since those are two areas where we're still seeing a pretty active sort of response from employers and a lot of postings still coming in, I think using Handshake is probably one of the first things that a student should think about doing. So logging on, making sure you're doing a search for it. If you search for remote, you're also going to be able to pull up any positions that are obviously remote at the moment. It's important to keep in mind that a lot of employers are open to positions obviously being or starting remote right now because of everything, all the guidelines that are in place. But the intention is that for many of those positions, they will eventually move back to the office or to headquarters or to wherever it is. So if a student is looking at those, just make sure that they're reading sort of the fine print on all of that so that as they apply, they sort of know what they're getting into. But we have seen, I think the most recent stat that I just saw last night was about 111% increase in remote positions that have been posted just within the past couple of weeks. And so obviously, I think for both us in higher education, but also in technology and in industry, companies are starting to realize this shelter in place is going to last a lot longer than we had maybe initially hoped. And so I think people really are trying to pivot and look at some of those things. So one option, one strategy is definitely to log into Handshake and do that. Another option that I would also recommend is make sure that you're actually talking to people who are in those areas so that you're well informed of what's actually changing and what are the trends, what are the things that are sort of like pain points or keeping people up at night so that you can do your very best on the interview. You want to be able to talk as if you are already in that field and already working with those folks. So networking is going to be really important. And obviously you can do that through peer messaging on Handshake, but you can also use LinkedIn. You can use your, I know University of Rochester uses People Grove, and so you can use the Meliora Collective to find alums that can also help you around that, but you need to use all of your resources right now to make sure that you're connecting to and doing your research so that you'll be the strongest candidate possible. And obviously a warm connection to any of those opportunities is going to be better than a cold one.
And I'll just add a couple of things. And today, I think you can put these links in the chat, but we've identified a couple of online resources where they're identifying which internships have moved remote, which internships are still active, which internships have been canceled. So there are some opportunities to kind of take a landscape of like which industry sectors and which organizations are still moving forward to trying to adapt to this environment, because some students might not be able to show up for their internship, so they might be looking to backfill some of those roles. So some of the resources we have on our COVID site on the Greene Center, I think will be helpful, at least to getting a landscape check on what's happening there. I think that's really critical. The other piece I think that's also important is kind of getting your understanding of where these industries are. And I think Christina alluded to this, and Danae's been hosting our mini podcast series over the last month or so. We're going to be posting interviews with alumni, and we're asking them the main question of, how is COVID impacting your industry sector? So I just did an interview this Monday with someone in venture capital. Danae's been doing a few other interviews, and I think we have some really interesting interviews coming up. So you can hear from alumni and their perspective on how it might be impacting their industry sector, which goes to Christine's point of understanding what you're getting into so that you can help provide solutions to problems they may be facing already. And you're kind of selling them on your value to address those problems. So I think all of these pieces, I don't think there's one solution. It's kind of a strategy that combines a lot of different elements. And I think this is an important time to really be expanding that out and thinking about different ways to do that.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Yeah, and just to shed some more light about the podcast series, our first 3 have gone live this week, and they can be found on our website. They can also be found on Apple Podcasts or even Spotify if that's your thing. And so far, we've talked with someone in finance and consulting, someone who is in the healthcare, higher ed sector, and then we also had another one Oh man, I'm blinking. This is embarrassing. But I will send you a link and you can go check them out. They're really great. We've had some really great conversations. Oh, I remember. We had one in the tech industry. So that was really cool. So we're really trying to get a wide variety of insights and different advice from all of these alums in these different industries so that we can really help students or even the average person listening that wants to get some insight on what's going on. So I'll put the link in the chat. To keep the conversation going, I know, Christine, you had touched upon a little bit networking, and we have a question that just came in asking if you had some more specific strategies for how to network right now, especially since we are remote, and even what works for you, like if you have specific tricks or advice for these students who are trying to navigate this.
Sure. I have a few thoughts here. So obviously we've already talked about places you can go to find folks, right? Meliora Collective, LinkedIn, Handshake. So you know the options of where to go. I'll give you some tips on kind of how to approach it. So when you actually reach out to someone, be really specific about what it is you want to talk about in the 15, 20, 30 minutes that you're sort of asking for. I'll just say personally, when I get a request with somebody that wants to chat for an informational interview, I'm almost always willing to give of my time. But I am much more likely to respond to somebody faster if they're specific with like, I want to learn more about your industry, or I'm thinking about this switch and I want to hear about your transition, or I want to hear about X, Y, and Z. That gives me a chance to know that the conversation is going to be more worthwhile of my time and it'll be more targeted. So just make sure that you're not wasting anyone's time, because if you leave it too vague, people will be like, I don't know what she's going to ask, or I don't know what he's interested in. So maybe I'll just pass on that, right? And you don't want them to pass. So make sure you're specific with sort of the topics or the questions that you think you might want to cover in that time. The other thing that I would caution you to just be careful of and to make sure that you're ready for is you might be put in a group session. I say this because this is actually a new technique that I started recently. So I was getting a lot of requests and I didn't have enough time to host 10 different informational interviews every week. And so I started my assistant puts sort of like LinkedIn or like informational interview, like an hour block on my schedule once a month. And anyone that requests it, I pop them, we essentially tell them it's going to be a group session and I pop them into that same hour so that I can essentially answer everybody's questions, kind of like this live AMA, all at once. So just be prepared that for some of the people that you're reaching out to, if they're super, super busy, they may be doing group sessions. So you should just be prepared to make sure that you're going to be with other people that might also ask questions. And what that means is you want your questions to obviously stand out. So make sure you're coming up with you're crafting good questions. You're prepared to obviously also be a good listener because you'll be on screen with other people. You take some interest, or you might show some interest in asking one of the other participants a question, right? Those are some things that will help you stand out to the people that you're actually learning or speaking from. I always recommend that you use the time to also ask them about sort of like current events or advice that they have given this sort of unprecedented time. There are obviously lots of issues, lots of things that are keeping them up at night that they would probably be happy to talk about. And I would highly encourage you to use that as a way to do more research around what opportunities you're going to apply for, how you're going to position yourself, to Joe's point, all of the narrative around how you tell your story and what it is you're going to be able to bring to the table is going to be super, super important. Also make sure that you send a follow-up thank you quickly afterward. Obviously, everything is electronic, so there's really no excuse to wait more than probably 24 to 48 hours to be able to send your thank you right after. And so just make sure that you're doing all of those typical things that you would do even if you were meeting with someone in person.
And I'll add just two items that I think are interrelated to each other. I think number one, I think leading with empathy is really critical around this time and showing a care and concern for other people. So I think you shouldn't just dive into and be like, hey, I want to talk to you about like your industry. Like ask them how their families are, ask them how they are. Because I think this is impacting people in ways that we've never seen before. And so I think we don't always understand or know what their context could be. It could be that they have family members that are ill. They could be their own families or they themselves could be impacted directly by COVID. And so I think it's always important to genuinely really check in with people just on a human level, especially, which is a little different than what you might normally do around these times. The other piece is to remember that these are mutually beneficial. So they're going to ask you questions about, hey, how are you doing in this scenario? How's the university responding to this? How have you been navigating working, online or taking classes online? Have you been managing that well? What's some techniques you've been doing to manage your time or to really be effective in online learning? So you might be a source of information and insight for them. And I think that's an important piece of this, because I think we always think of these things as maybe one direction, you asking them questions, but you should be prepared. And I'm a firm believer that all of our students have something to offer to other people in terms of their own stories and their backgrounds and their experiences. And I know Christine and I both do this often, that we're going to ask you questions as well about your own experiences and about how you're navigating, because that's also insightful for us as people that you're networking with, about how you might be handling challenges or stress and adapting. So I would be prepared to really have that conversation. And I think being able to know that you can contribute something to them and also give them, I think, something that's valuable.
Awesome. That's really great advice. Thank you both. So we do have another question. How do you think that the pandemic has impacted the present and future workplace? And Christine, I'd actually like to piggyback off of that a little bit and see if you could speak upon some of the trends that you're seeing within the job market.
Sure. Wow, what is the pandemic not impacting when it comes to the workplace? I think, obviously, let me just state some of the obvious. I think virtual work, working from home, the flexibility piece, I think is huge. When the pandemic hit, it forced everybody to sort of accelerate a lot of the change that was already happening. Joe and I wrote an article a couple years ago around the future of work, and we talked about 4 different areas. And one of the areas that we obviously talked about was the gig economy, freelance work. We talked about this flexibility. We talked about diversity and inclusion. All of those things are now playing out for you in real time. And you're seeing sort of the impact of what this pandemic has on different student populations, different classes of people, both not only our students, but unfortunately also adults. And we're seeing what that looks like across the board and across multiple cities and different areas geographically in the United States. And I think when we look at what's going to happen post-COVID, I am most interested in sort of viewing what are the lessons that companies have actually learned that will stick with us after this is all over, right? I am positive. So these are a few of my predictions. I'm positive that many industries are going to, are you laughing at me?
No, I'm listening to you. I'm agreeing with you.
I'm so amused.
I'm not verbally agreeing with you.
I think, so one of my predictions is I think working from home and virtual sort of remote work is definitely going to be a bigger part of our workforce than it ever has been before, right? And I think you can look at that on a number of different levels. The longer this lasts, the more companies and the more institutions are going to realize, wow, actually there's a lot that can be done when you're not actually in person. Yeah. Right? People can still be productive. People can still get a lot of work done. People can still have meetings. So I think a lot of the sort of mundane is going to actually be virtual, and people will not think twice about that anymore because everyone will be more familiar and the technology piece of it will just be naturally more integrated. Now, does that mean that like no travel will happen or no meetings or things won't happen in person? Absolutely not. I think that's going to be really, really critical, and nothing replaces that human touch. I think people are just going to be more selective about what those things are and how they use their time, right? The reality is you can actually squeeze sometimes more meetings in when they're all virtual because you don't have to go anywhere. You're just hopping from one virtual room to another virtual room. And so it increases the amount of flexibility you have. I think the other piece to keep in mind with that is for a lot of companies, their office space that they lease is huge overhead. Yeah. And so when they are thinking about saving costs or they're thinking about how they allocate their budget and their money, that's a huge place of savings. And so might they still have an office, but maybe they only have certain teams that go in, or maybe they do a rotational schedule where some teams go in on certain weeks, right? Like these are honestly all of the conversations that not only are we having at Handshake, but we know that many of our employers are having as we figure out what is this going to look like afterward. I think one lesson that we've certainly learned at Handshake that's super important during this time is documentation. Being remote has forced us to be better communicators with each other, both in how we explain what it is we're working on, but also in how we keep each other aligned and how we keep each other updated. And I think a lot of those lessons around documentation are actually really good things for us to continue through. I've heard from a number of institutional partners that one of the things they really struggle with is when people leave, they lose all this institutional knowledge. And a huge piece of that is because they never documented that institutional knowledge. They counted on the fact that this person has been there for 10, 15, 20 years. And so they go to Mary whenever they need something, and now Mary's left, or Mary has retired, or whatever. And now they don't have anything to fall back on. So I think these are some of the things that people can do right now to make sure that you're setting yourself up well for the future. I also think when you look into a post-COVID world, there's going to be more focus on diversity and access. But I think the ways in which employers are actually seeking that talent is going to continue to change, and they're going to require and sort of demand even more accessibility to be able to see that swath of sort of like candidate base. And I think it's higher education's responsibility, along with technology, of course, to sort of help to surface that so that you don't sort of have pockets where you're literally just like losing people through the cracks, right? And I think they're going to be held more accountable from their boards to actually have a workforce that is representative of perhaps their client base or who they serve and things like that. And so I think that's not going to leave the conversation. And I think institutions right now that aren't getting on board with that or don't understand how to increase or look at opening up access to opportunity, they're going to be left behind in how they proceed. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Danielle, I have one quick thing. I think, especially as it pertains to our students and undergraduate or graduate students in sort of examining where opportunities are, what's happening with COVID also is it's exposing where the gaps are in a lot of different services and a lot of different systems and constructs that we have. And whether that's food service industry or whether that's healthcare or transportation, it's starting to show where the areas that are most vulnerable, which then I think what happened in 2008, what happened in 2000 is in those recessions is that new companies were sort of formed to fill the gaps that were exposed because of those downturns. And I think that's the same thing that I think will happen with COVID, is that it's exposing all these gaps, which then lead to new nonprofit organizations that pop up that maybe are dedicated to giving internet access to everyone as a utility moving forward. But there might be also opportunities for startups that are money-making organizations, that there's investments that might come in to fill gaps that might exist, whether it's the educational systems or anything else. So I think there's an interesting piece here that in these down times, economically as well as in terms of jobs, it's also usually the creation of new companies and new opportunities that we didn't anticipate that would come, but also that we didn't know that we needed until a crisis hit different parts of the world. So I think there's going to be an interesting sort of uptick in those kinds of innovations and those kinds of opportunities. And I think this is where our students in particular, I'm partial to U of R students, they kind of fill the gap in identifying so many different innovations that might solve bigger problems now that have been exposed, because the pessimist might tell you that this might not be the last pandemic that we're going to face, or some sort of global kind of crisis of this magnitude that might impact us. So how do we prevent this from happening again, and how do we prevent some of the mistakes that have been made either internationally or nationally from happening again? And I think that's usually where innovation comes from. So that's going to be another area, I think, for opportunity for many of our students and graduates.
Okay, so that makes me actually think of one other thing. You and I were talking about this earlier this week, but there was an article from Mark Andreessen, who's a VC in Silicon Valley entrepreneur, very well known. And one of the things he talks about, or that he recently put out, was that this pandemic is showing us that we haven't built enough, right? Yep. For the kind of economy we are, for the country that we are. What we haven't done is build. And I think he simplifies some things when it comes to certain sectors, but what my takeaway from that was, we have to actually think about building the right systems and the right infrastructure to be able to actually do some of these things that we want done, and to be able to address those gaps that Joe was just talking about, right? And so there was one excerpt, and I won't be able to find it fast enough, so I won't make you obviously hold online while I look for that, but his point in this one part was that it really comes down to drive, and it comes down to will. And too often, the incumbents in whatever industry, right? And for those of you that are on the line, I know we definitely have some folks in career services here. you know, and you're like probably thinking of some of those colleagues in our field right now who are the incumbents in our field that don't actually have a desire to change. In fact, their desire to not change is greater than their desire to try and adapt to what is happening right now, right? And the only way we're going to actually effectively build systems or operations that will be able to take us into the sort of the future or what is next, we have to have that desire, we have to have that drive, we have to have that hunger. And so a huge piece of it is actually mindset. And I think that's a much more challenging piece to sort of tackle, is how do we help shift that mindset and actually motivate people to want to build.
Great. Yeah. In relation to that a little bit, Joe or Christine, I'd love to get your thoughts on how faculty and advisors can help students right now in the future, even maybe when the dust settles a bit, because I know you guys are both talking about there are some gaps, and with everything that is going on, there are opportunities for people who do have that drive to obviously be doing something.
Mm-hmm. Joe, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think faculty, especially at a place like U of R, are such an integral and critical part of a student's educational experience. So I think faculty as advisors, faculty as providing insight to different industries and fields and research that's happening, they're so important in shaping how students view what's possible and the opportunities that exist. So I think it's important that faculty continue to do that, right? They continue to share their insights and perspectives on their particular research areas or their industry or their disciplines, and how what's happening right now, is impacting that. I think it's important that, and we can help with providing those vehicles, but I think it's even them just jumping on Zoom and holding a forum to share with students about what they think this impact is going to be on a particular area. So I think that insight and that expertise that they have and sort of reflecting on what's happening is really, really important. I think this is a time, and you've heard Christine and I talk about this already, a number of times today. The necessity for students to adapt to what's coming, I think, is really important. I think they need people that are supportive of that and that can provide a safety net for them in terms of processing that, reflecting on that, thinking through possibilities. And I often find faculty members as great advisors to students, to give them that forum and that community to really kind of think through those different options that might exist. And I think they're a critical partner for our office. And I think this is an opportunity for us to enhance or strengthen those partnerships, because there might be gaps of information that they don't have on what's happening in a particular industry area. And I think there's definitely gaps of information that we have as an office of how it might impact very specific fields or disciplines. So I think the combination and the partnership, I think, is even more important in these times to provide students with a wide lens of what's possible with their degrees, but also what might be changing out in the world around us in either very specific narrow areas or really broad, complex systems.
I would just add on to that and say there are probably three things that faculty could really focus on right now. I think one is helping students to actually make the connection between what they're learning in the classroom, or how they're learning, and how that could be applied in the real world. I shouldn't say that. This is the real world. It's all the real world. But how they apply it to industry is very, very important. And I think there's so many options in how faculty choose their pedagogy. And obviously some of that is limited right now while they're doing virtual teaching, and they're starting to explore what those new pedagogical sort of advances will look like. But for them to actually be explicit about, hey, I asked you to do this group project because I want you to be able to learn how to conflict manage. I want you to be able to learn how to influence. I want you to be able to learn how to verbally present, right? For example, are three things that we know employers really, really want. But students often don't equate their group project to all of those competencies. And so for a faculty member, if you just made it explicit, that would be super helpful for a student, so that when they're working on their profile or their resume, when they go to an interview, they're able to recall that, and then they can use those examples in their interview, or to be able to exhibit how they've actually done some of those things. So I think the first one is just making it super, super explicit. I think the second thing to keep in mind is that career education really has to be integrated into the academic experience now more than ever, right? So we just talked about how, unfortunately, the pandemic, while it doesn't discriminate who it hits, the impact of it does discriminate. and it has huge differential sort of impact on different student populations. And so while we are looking at online learning, and I know many institutions right now are still figuring out what exactly they're going to do for the fall semester, what that means is that the only actual required thing that students are going to have to do are their classes. That is the only experience that every student is going to have to do. And so if we don't get career education further embedded and integrated into the academic experience, you are going to lose students. And you're likely to lose the students that actually need it the most. And so faculty that are actually open to this can be the sort of guinea pigs and the champions and the first to sort of adopt that and figure out how they can very easily integrate those pieces into their courses. And I bet anything, if we were to do studies, you would see a differential sort of impact in those students versus those that take classes with faculty who aren't willing to integrate. So that's the second thing. And then the last thing I would say is it's super important for faculty probably now. I've always pushed this, but I think now more than ever for faculty to actually be engaged with industry. So Joe, you already mentioned this, for them to actually share about what's happening in their various fields of study or practice. But the reality is there are a lot of faculty that don't actually know because they haven't been connected with folks in industry where they can actually see their work applied to products, to technology, to policy, whatever it is. And so what can we do as sort of career services professionals to help make some of those connections so that faculty could essentially do sort of almost like tours of duty or their own career treks, however we want to think about it, so that they're regularly actually seeing in real time, this is how someone might actually use this theory, or how someone might use these equations, or how someone might use this particular theology to apply into sort of real product or real things that people are using on a day-to-day. And then they can then integrate that into their teaching, which goes to essentially the first 2 points that I made. So I think those are 3 things that faculty could definitely do to help our students right now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for your insight. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to open up the chance for Joe, if you have any last questions for Christine, or even vice versa. Christine, if you had any questions for Joe, I figured we could do maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll call it a day.
Awesome.
Do you have any questions you want to ask?
Always have questions I want to ask. I will actually toss one over to you. I am most curious from your perspective. You've worked at a lot of different institutions, different sizes, different types. After all of this, I shouldn't even say after, let's just go with fall semester, this next academic year. What do you think is truly actually going to transform in higher education? Or you could do career services, whichever angle you want. And what do you think is still going to be a struggle and still isn't actually going to change?
I think I'll take the second part. I think what will continue to be a struggle is how we deliver high quality education virtually or online. I think for many institutions that have not positioned themselves really well for that and invested in infrastructure, I think it's gonna be a challenge. I think even with the amount of time between now and the fall semester, that's not a lot of time to really create a high quality online delivery of educational experiences. So I think that will continue to be a challenge. I think because we're trying to mobilize, hundreds of faculty members at many institutions. We're trying to shift technology as well as infrastructure to support those. We're trying to help students be better online learners. Because I think we take for granted that we think students, they can adapt and they'll figure out how to learn online, but it is a different kind of experience. So do we have the right tutoring and support for them? And I think there's the access issue. I think not all of our students have access to all the resources that we think that they need to be successful as online learners. Do they have the technology they need? Do they have the community and support that they need, the tutoring that they need? Those are really different areas I think that are critical to think about. I think what might be sort of positive outcome for some of this is I think institutions will create more systemic structures or infrastructure within their organizations to be able to adapt faster. I think they're going to create maybe new constructs within their organizations to almost be ready for other disruptions that might come about, and how we can be really much more nimble in responding to these types of things. So there might be either standing organizations within institutions, or there might be standing committees or parts of the institution that almost are thinking through all the different scenarios that might happen and making sure we have invested those things I just mentioned that might be lacking in certain spaces. I think that might be very much a real thing that happens in a lot of institutions, is creating these types of organizations if they don't already exist. But I think most don't have, I think, an organization like that or entity like that within them to that degree that thinks about things in a very systemic way from across the institution.
Well, we can hope.
Yes.
That's really creative.
I'm optimistic.
That's great. That's awesome. It's good to hear.
Well, thanks, Christine, for joining today. I really appreciate it. Obviously, it's always good to chat with you. So I'm glad that you were able to hang out and give us some advice. And maybe we'll have you get back on again if Danae approves that request.
Yes, thank you, Christine. This was awesome. You did such a great job of sharing some really great insight. And we're so excited to see, like you mentioned, a little bit of what's to come from Handshake.
That's awesome. Thank you all so much for having me. This was great.
Of course. And thank you for everyone who joined the AMA this week. I just want to put out there that we will be doing this for the next few weeks. So stay tuned for those, and we'll let you know if there are any additional special guests. But again, thank you for listening, and thank you for the awesome questions.
Thanks, Danae.
Of course. Bye.
Bye.